Somewhere on your property, a piece of metal is quietly failing. The screws in your deck, the nails in your fence, the hangers under your porch. Manufacturers rate them for 20 or 30 years, and in the wrong wood, they can be gone in 5. Yet in Westminster Abbey hangs a door dated by its tree rings to the 1050s, still swinging where medieval hands left it. That iron was forged by men who could not read, in furnaces that never got hot enough to melt it. Why does their metal outlast ours by centuries? The answer spent nearly 2,000 years buried in a Scottish field, and when it finally came out of the ground, the people who lined up to study it were engineers designing containers for nuclear waste. Perthshire, Scotland, 1960. Archaeologists led by Sir Ian Richmond were closing out years of excavation at Inchtuthil, a Roman legionary fortress on the River Tay, when they cut into the floor of the fortress workshop and hit a pit 12 feet deep. Inside lay more than 875,000 iron nails, around 10 tons of metal, everything from 2.5-inch tacks to 15-inch spikes, the largest single hoard of Roman ironwork ever found, before or since. The story behind that pit is simple and desperate. Around the year 87, the 20th Legion was ordered off the northern frontier to plug a crisis on the Danube. 10 tons of iron was too heavy to march south and too dangerous to leave, because to the local tribes iron was worth more than silver, and every pound abandoned would come back sharpened. The Legion dug the pit, tipped in the nails, sealed them under 6 feet of packed gravel, and demolished the workshop on top to erase the spot. It stayed erased for 1,873 years. When the pit finally opened, the outer nails had rusted together into a hard crust. But that crust became a shield. It sealed out water and air, and the nails at the centre came out with their hammer marks still crisp, some close to the condition they were in on the day a Roman smith headed them. There were so many that thousands were sold off to the public. 5 shillings bought you a large one, and plenty of them are still sitting in desk drawers across Britain today, unrusted, doing quiet victory laps around every fastener sold since. Here is the detail everyone missed at the time. The most serious students of that hoard arrived decades later from a field nobody would have guessed. Scientists working on the burial of radioactive waste studied the Inchtuthil nails to learn how iron corrodes underground across thousands of years. Think about that assignment for a second. You are asked to design a container that must outlast recorded history, and there is exactly one dataset on Earth, iron that already survived 19 centuries in wet Scottish ground. An honest investigation flags the obvious objection, and here it is. Part of what saved those nails was the burial itself, a mass of iron shielding its own core. True, but the same metal performs the same trick above ground, in open weather, with no shield at all. At village churches like Stillingfleet in Yorkshire, door ironwork forged in the 1100s still hangs exposed to 9 centuries of English rain. Which raises the real question: what was that metal? Walk into a medieval smelting yard, and the first thing you notice is what is missing. There is no molten iron anywhere. The furnace, called a bloomery, was a clay chimney roughly the height of a man, charged with charcoal and crushed ore, driven by hand-pumped bellows. It never reached the melting point of iron. After hours of blasting, the smelter broke the furnace open and dragged out a glowing, spongy mass called a bloom, part iron and part glassy slag, tangled together. Then came the labour. Smiths hammered the bloom while it glowed white, squeezing slag out the way you wring water from a rag, folding the metal, welding it to itself, hammering again. The iron that survived this beating earned its name. Wrought iron, because wrought simply means worked. Look closely at what all that work produced, because every detail pays off later in this story. The metal was nearly pure iron, carrying less than 0.1% carbon. Threaded through it ran 1% or 2% of leftover slag, drawn out into long glassy fibres that give the metal a grain like wood. Cut an old wrought bar, polish the face, and you can see that grain with your naked eye. 2 quieter details were set by the fuel and the dirt. Charcoal burns almost free of sulphur, and sulphur is poison to iron. It makes the metal brittle at the forge and hungrier for rust in the rain. And many of the ore's medieval smelters dug carried phosphorus, which stayed behind in the finished iron. That trace of phosphorus looked like nothing at the time. It was not nothing. Hold on to it. From the smelter, iron travelled out as slim square rods to specialist craftsmen called nailers, and a nailer's whole day was rhythm. He heated the rod, hammered the tip to a point on 4 sides, cut the shank to length, dropped it into a bore in his anvil, and finished the head with a few glancing blows, leaving the faceted crown that collectors now call a rose head. No 2 nails came out identical. A skilled nailer might finish a few hundred small nails in a long working day, which tells you exactly what each one cost in human time. That cost shaped how people treated them. Nails were pulled, straightened, and reused when buildings came down. They were inventoried by monasteries, traded by weight, and guarded like coin. In Vienna, a tree trunk called the Stockim Eisen still stands behind glass, studded with hundreds of nails hammered in as offerings across the centuries, the earliest driven around 1440. People do not nail offerings into a tree unless the nail itself carries real value, and those nails went into everything the age is remembered for. Ship hulls, drawbridge planking, roof shingles, and the great studded church doors, where rows of iron heads were a display of wealth, shown off the way later centuries showed off silver. And one more thing about the shape, because it matters more than it looks. That shank was square and tapered. Drive it into oak, and it does not drill a neat round hole through the fibres. It wedges between them, and the wood clamps back around it like a fist. Carpenters understood this so well that when smooth, round machine nails appeared centuries later, builders resisted them for years on the record because the old square nails simply held better. They lost the argument anyway. We will get to why. First, the chemistry, because this is where the 800 years actually come from. Why does wrought iron refuse to rust away? 3 reasons. The first is purity. Steel is iron plus carbon, and inside steel that carbon forms a compound called iron carbide. In damp conditions, iron and iron carbide behave like the 2 poles of a microscopic battery, millions of tiny cells running on the metal itself, eating it from within. Wrought iron carries almost no carbon. The battery barely exists. The second is the slag. Those glassy fibres threading the metal act like fire breaks. Rust creeping across the surface hits glass and stalls, so corrosion that races through modern steel spreads slowly and grudgingly through wrought iron. And I will be straight with you here, because this audience checks sources. Metallurgists still argue over how much credit the slag deserves, and a few studies suggest the inclusions can even channel corrosion under certain conditions. That argument is about mechanism. What nobody argues about is the field record, and the field record is 900-year-old hinges hanging in open weather. The third reason is that trace of phosphorus, and here the story stops being theory. In Delhi stands an iron pillar 7 metres tall, forged around 16 centuries ago, standing in the open air ever since, carrying barely a streak of rust. Metallurgists at the Indian Institute of Technology in Kanpur analysed it and found unusually high phosphorus. In iron like that, the phosphorus reacts with the first thin film of rust and converts it into a hard, tightly bonded protective layer. The metal seals itself shut. On high phosphorus iron, rust becomes a skin. On modern steel, rust becomes a wound. It flakes away, exposes fresh metal, and flakes again, cycle after cycle, until the nail is nothing but an orange stain in the wood. You have seen both with your own eyes. Old ironwork wears a stable, dark, almost blue-black surface that stops changing. A modern nail left outside weeps orange through its first winter. The medieval smith knew none of these words. He knew results. Iron smelted from this hillside outlasted iron from that one. Charcoal from this wood forged cleaner than charcoal from another, and reputations rose and fell on the difference. A bad batch meant a snapped ploughshare at planting time or a horse thrown on the road, and word travelled fast in a world where everyone knew the smith by name. Quality control by consequence. Centuries of that selection pressure did quietly what no laboratory was doing, and modern steelmakers remove phosphorus on purpose. In steel, phosphorus causes brittleness, so out it goes at the mill, a perfectly reasonable choice for a bridge girder. But understand what that means for the 10-cent nail in your fence. The single element most responsible for iron surviving 1,000 years is deliberately taken out. Before this story turns industrial, a quick note. This channel exists to recover old methods that still work, and we practice what we dig up. At medievalway.store, you will find our sourdough manual, built on the slow fermentation medieval bakers relied on, our practical refined recipes cookbook, and the sourcing guide for finding honest ingredients. Now, back to the iron, because in 1709 the Great Trade begins. In 1709 at Coalbrookdale in England, an ironmaster named Abraham Darby smelted iron with coke instead of charcoal. Coke is baked coal, and coal was cheap in a way charcoal could never be. There was one catch: coal carries sulphur, the exact poison that charcoal had spared the old iron. The change looked minor, one fuel swapped for another. In reality, it was the opening move in a 2-century trade, durability sold off piece by piece in exchange for volume. In 1784, Henry Court's puddling furnace put wrought iron onto an industrial footing, faster, cheaper, and far less patient. By the early 1800s, machines were shearing nails from flat iron plate, the square-cut nails that built the 19th century, still respectable metal, still gripping wood the old way. Then came the real break. In 1856, Henry Bessemer showed the world how to blow air through molten iron and produce steel in minutes instead of days at a fraction of the old cost. By the mid-1880s, mills were drawing that cheap steel into round wire and feeding it to machines that gripped, cut, pointed and headed a finished nail faster than you can blink. One machine outproduced a village of nailers before lunch. By 1913, 9 of every 10 nails manufactured were wire nails. Now tally what got lost in that switch. 3 things. The carbon came up, which armed the rust. The phosphorus came out, removed on purpose at the mill. And the slag vanished entirely because fully molten steel is homogeneous. No fibres, no grain, no fire breaks. Every property that let a medieval nail shrug off 800 winters was engineered out of its replacement, not out of malice, out of arithmetic. Wire was cheap, and a nail that costs nearly nothing does not have to last. The industry's answer to rust was a coating. Galvanizing wraps steel in zinc, and the zinc sacrifices itself to protect the iron underneath, which works exactly as long as the zinc lasts. On cheap electro-galvanized fasteners, that layer is measured in millionths of a meter. Once it wears through, the steel beneath rusts like the unprotected metal it always was. Even the grip was a downgrade. A smooth round wire nail holds by friction alone, and the builders of the 1890s said so loudly while it took over their trade. They were right about the holding power. They lost on price. And for 100 years that trade still looked like a bargain. Then, in 2003, the bargain turned on the people holding it. Stop for a moment, because this next part is happening on your property right now, and it can cost you thousands. In 2003, under pressure over arsenic, the lumber industry agreed to pull the old wood preservative, chromated copper arsenate, out of residential lumber. A defensible call, since arsenic has no business around children. But the replacements, sold under names like ACQ, protect the wood with far heavier loads of copper. And copper sitting against steel, with rainwater finding both, forms a galvanic cell. The copper wins. The steel dissolves. Chemically speaking, a modern pressure-treated deck is hostile territory for the very fasteners holding it together. When the United States Forest Products Laboratory tested ordinary galvanized fasteners against the new treatments, samples corroded across nearly their entire surface. Out in the real world, the failure pattern is ugly. A deck whose boards look perfect and are rated to last 25 years, standing on screws with no core left inside them. And a deck rarely fails empty. It fails under barbecues, birthdays, and grandparents. Building codes eventually caught up and now demand heavier protection in treated wood. But a code update does not crawl under a deck that went up in 2005 with whatever the hardware aisle had on sale. That job falls to you, and here is what to do about it this weekend. Get under your deck. Look for orange streaks bleeding from screw heads and joist hangers, because that stain is the metal leaving. Pay closest attention to the ledger board, the connection bolting the deck to your house, since that one joint carries everything. If a screw head snaps off under a light tap, stop using the deck and call a professional. And whenever you build or repair with treated lumber, use nothing but hot-dip galvanized fasteners rated G185, or better still, stainless steel. Stainless costs more by the box. A rebuilt deck costs more by the order of magnitude. Buy metal that outlives the wood. That is the medieval math, and it has not stopped working, which leaves one obvious move. Skip the steel entirely and buy wrought iron. Here is the part that still surprises people. You cannot. True wrought iron is no longer mass-produced anywhere on Earth. The last commercial works rolling it went quiet in the 20th century, and today, when restorers need the genuine material for a cathedral gate or a heritage bridge, they buy salvage. Old anchor chain, demolished Victorian railings, retired bridge iron, cut apart and forged again. There are firms in England whose entire business is hunting down scrap of the real thing at demolition sales, because a metal that once held the medieval world together can no longer be purchased new at any steel supplier on the planet. Sit with that. In an age that can print a rocket engine, the fastener technology of a village blacksmith is functionally extinct. Meanwhile, the bill for its replacement keeps arriving. The world's largest association of corrosion engineers puts the global cost of corrosion at $2.5 trillion every single year, around 3.4% of everything humanity produces. Read that figure against a door that has hung since the 1050s. Some of that bill is unavoidable chemistry. A portion of it is the entirely predictable price of building the modern world from a metal selected by the pound instead of by the century. A fastener that lasts 800 years is a fastener you buy once, and nobody's quarterly earnings improve when you buy once. That is not a conspiracy. It is an incentive, and incentives do not need meetings. The door in Westminster Abbey is still on duty. The nails from that Scottish pit sit in museum cases and desk drawers around the world, still solid at their hearts after 19 centuries. The men who made these things never saw a periodic table and could not have spelled phosphorus. But they worked slowly, with clean fuel and patient fire, and they answered to neighbours instead of shareholders. The smith who forged your hinges lived down the road and would pass your door every day for the rest of his life. That accountability was a technology of its own, and it produced metal we can no longer buy. The knowledge never left. It is sitting in the ground, hanging on church doors, holding up gates that were old before your country existed, waiting for someone to ask one simple question. Why hasn't this rusted? Now you know the answer, and you know exactly what to check under your own deck before summer. Subscribe, and let's keep digging up what they buried.